Glory to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This video will continue with the period of history leading up to the baptism of the Rus, but also this will discuss what was happening during the late 900s and into the early 1000s as we approach the period of the Great Schism, the unfortunate and tragic event where the West fully falls away from orthodoxy in the year 1054 AD. So now I'm going to basically use the date range in this video from around 963 through through the beginning of the 1000s. And of course, the year 1000 will mark the end of the first millennium and the beginning of the second millennium after the nativity of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Now, of course, one of the most important and miraculous events during this period was the baptism of the Rus. Here in the it's orangey color here, the Kievan Rus. I will get up to this event later in the video, but I'm just going to say now that the baptism of the Rus is very important because the Rus will come to Christianity through the Patriarchate of Constantinople, so through orthodoxy. Unfortunately, many of the other groups of people that have been that come to Christianity and have been coming to Christianity during the 800s and the 900s and into the 1000s after the Rus, like some of the other Viking groups, will be coming through the Latin West. And many of them will follow the Latin West, unfortunately, into full-blown papism after the year 1054. Now, just to reiterate something about the Latin West, that under papism, we will actually see a very monolithic papist Latin culture and identity forming among the papists. And the papists will, over the next, of course, through really until modern times, but for the next, all through the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1800s, will basically force a very papist way and among all of the people that they take over, especially beginning with the West itself. And I say this because, remember, we're in the 900s, so we have almost 1,000 years of the West being Christian, and for the most part being, of course, very Orthodox for the first 800 years. But it's only until around the time of Charlemagne that we have this problem really focused more within the Frankish territory and the Frankish parts of Italy. Of course, the Frankish parts of Italy being where the Patriarchate of Rome is located also. So we see this part of the Latin West really spearheading the heresies that were happening, namely the Filioque. Of course, we know which is the insertion into the heretical insertion into the creed of the and the Son, referring to a double procession of the Holy Spirit. We have also some of the alterations to baptism, where in many places within the Latin West at this time, they are actually starting to sprinkle or use aspersion rather than full immersion through holy baptism. Also, there's a trend of a somewhat elitist kind of mentality where only Latin is being enforced. And we see that this was an issue in the time of St. Kyrillos and St. Methodios when the Great Moravians and other Slavic groups were coming to Christianity. And St. Kyrillos and St. Methodios wanted to preach to them and allow it so that they would use liturgically the Slavic language, where the Latin West, who was trying to get them to become part of them, insisted on Latin. But luckily they had an ally in Pope John VIII, who was, as I said in the previous video, one of the last somewhat orthodox popes at this time. But unfortunately, as we get after Pope John VIII, the subsequent popes were quite heretical through the rest of the 900s and into the 1000s. even though technically Rome was still in communion with the rest of the Orthodox patriarchates, in essence, the heresy was getting quite bad already at this point. However, remember, these heresies were focused within primarily the Frankish areas, and we cannot say that all of the West at this time, the Latin West, was fully influenced by that. Because we do know that the British Isles, such as Ireland and England, uh, were somewhat shielded from some of these developments. Now, how much the Filioque might have entered in locally in some places, it's hard to say, but we do know that they were for the most part still Orthodox and and still very quite ascetical, with a lot of ascetical monastics and monastic saints still during this time. And the same can also be said for the Christians that sort of got stuck under Islamic control within the Islamic occupied parts of Hispania, as well as the Christians in the Islamic occupied parts of North Africa. In the Western North Africa, which today, of course, would be like the countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and parts of Libya, uh, where there was still a sizable Christian population, but for the most part, a lot of them were cut off from the other Orthodox patriarchates in terms of communication. There was some, there was some communication with Carthage and the other patriarchates, which I believe there was a local council at one point where the Bishop of Carthage was present. But at some point, they sort of disappear from history as gradually this area becomes Islamicized, and the Christian population just shrinks more and more in this region. Unfortunately, remember, the Church of Carthage was a very ancient and very influential local church in earlier times, and we had, of course, saints like Saint Perpetua and Felicity and their companions in Carthage. Saint Augustine of Hippo Regius was one of the cities within the bishops within the local church of Carthage. Saint Cyprianos, the holy martyr, hieromartyr, who is one of the church fathers also, and wrote um, a lot about theology and the church. So the Church of Carthage but the Church of Carthage, remember, was semi-autonomous in the sense that it was part of in the orbit of Rome's Patriarchate, but it had a lot of autonomy under the Archbishop of Carthage. But now we see that unfortunately the Christians are becoming a smaller and smaller minority in this Muslim controlled part of North Africa. Now, there was some pushback on the Muslims from the Eastern Roman Empire, especially, and we know that Crete was actually liberated from the Muslims because it had been under, if we remember in the map earlier, it had been under the Islamic Caliphate as well as Sicily. So the Eastern Roman Empire actually was able to liberate some of the Greek islands that had been actually controlled by the Arabs. And it was actually Emperor Nikephoros II, who liberated Crete and some of the Greek islands from the Islamic Caliphate. Now, of course, within the East, this part had been already under Muslim rule for a few hundred years. Of course, the patriarchates of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria had been under Muslim rule pretty much since the very beginning of Islam conquering this area. There was a brief period in the 900s where Antioch was um, actually part of the Eastern Roman Empire once again, but unfortunately it was only very brief. And also within the Middle East, there were a lot of newer cities that were just being developed, but Islamic cities that were just being developed during this period. For example, and I don't know if I really mentioned this in the previous videos, but when the Islamic Caliphate was more unified, um, their central city had become Baghdad. So Baghdad had become the capital of the entire Islamic Caliphate when it was politically unified. And it's very important because remember, Islam as a religion is very political. And even the founder of Islam, their pseudo prophet, who created this political reality right away. So there was always this political aspect, because that is also, if we consider, like I said, Islam as a heresy, it is also going against, obviously, the Christian creed, the Orthodox creed, where we say we look to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. Because we understand as Orthodox Christians that, of course, it's Christ's kingdom ultimately that is the ultimate kingdom, and that earthly Orthodox Christian states, sovereign empires or kingdoms, are serving Christ's eternal kingdom. And we know we don't expect Orthodox Christian kingdoms to be eternal. We expect the church and God's eternal kingdom to be eternal. But we know that Orthodox Christian kingdoms can fall away or can pass or can expand, but those are earthly things. But the Muslims don't have that concept, obviously. So everything is just in this world, basically. So, and that's something that they influence that they got from the rabbinical Judaism, also, where everything is worldly, just like the way the Jews have to have in Israel, because that's somehow the fulfillment of their existence, an earthly country in the Middle East. The Muslims are really no different in the sense that their Islamic caliphate was of the same spirit. And that spirit, remember, is the spirit of Babylon. That's why it was no coincidence that the Muslim caliphate centered itself on Baghdad, because Baghdad was actually the continuation of Babylon, because the ancient city Babylon is right next to it. Now, the more ancient city Babylon in Mesopotamia by this point had fallen into ruins, but the Islamic city that rose in its place was Baghdad. So that's why Baghdad features in a lot of this, even to this day, in a lot of the modern wars, because spiritually it is Babylon, and spiritually the Muslims are very much an anti-authority that is part of Babylon, ultimately. And the same thing is true in some of the other places, like in Egypt, where we have newer cities like Cairo, which was founded actually by a someone who was a Greek-speaking Sicilian convert to Islam, an apostate from Christianity who converted to Islam, al-Sikili, who founded the city of Cairo. And Cairo, of course, is a city that was built very close to the ancient city Memphis. Of course, the ancient city being which was the capital of ancient Egypt. Where the pyramids and the Sphinx are in Egypt. That city, the Islamic city that rose in its place, is now Cairo. So we're starting to see some of the political landscape that we would understand today. Now remember, the Islamic states, and as well as the states in Western Europe that will fall into papism, all of them technically become what we consider to be anti-authority. Because if we understand that or the original true Christendom was the Orthodox Christian states that lived, ideally, were supposed to live in harmony with each other. Um, we see this being replaced gradually by anti-authorities. Obviously, the Middle East being conquered by the Muslims, and the kingdoms in the West falling into heresy. And we call them anti-authorities because this is all not because now we're entering the next millennium, and even for the next 1,000 years until basically our time in the beginning of the millennium after. Now we're in the 2000s. We see the creation of a more global anti-authority, which we would consider to be something like the New World Order. And we call it an anti-authority because it is basically of the Antichrist spirit, and that's what all these things, the heresies, even modern day ecumenism, is to bring together all of these things into an anti-ecclesia, or a counterfeit church, in a counterfeit kingdom that will have its counterfeit king, that we know that of course that ultimately will be the Antichrist. But getting back to this period, now that we have all this in mind, we see the seriousness of what is going on now, as the West is falling away. Now, I started the map here because this is the period when the East Franks will take this title of Roman Empire, which of course, as Orthodox Christians, like I said, we never accepted this title for them because the true empire is the Empire of Constantinople. And of course, in the 987, a year before the conversion of the Rus, because the baptism of the Kievan Rus in the time of Saint Vladimir of the Rus is in the year 988. And in the year 987, West Francia becomes the Kingdom of France. So a lot of these things are all happening at the same time. Now, turning our attention once again now to the north and into Northern Europe, we see that the Vikings were a main source of tribulation during this period because now the Vikings were the last most prominent and aggressive, you can say, group of people who were pagans in this part of the world. Um, of course, we have the Hungarians who were pagan, the Magyars, who also their conversion is in around the year 1000, a little bit after the Rus, as well as some of the other groups here. But when it comes to the Vikings themselves, because they were raiding and pillaging so much, it was a lot of tribulation on a lot of the people. And by this point, the Danelaw has been conquered by the now unified England, which was, as I said, under the Kingdom of Wessex, which absorbed the other kingdoms and pushed out the Danes. And gradually, the Danes, the Vikings that live here, will gradually become Christian at this point. Um, and then, of course, we have Vikings in other places that are settling parts of Iceland and then parts of Greenland and even parts of Vinland, which is the part of Newfoundland and parts of Canada at this time. And then also there was another Viking group called the Normans, as we said, that also that in around the year 911 become Christian through the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, which was named after Saint Claros, who was a very Orthodox saint. Unfortunately, the Normans themselves do not follow in his footsteps. Now remember, Saint Claros was an Orthodox ascetic, a very holy saint from Rochester, England, who lived and asceticized in parts of the northern West Francia before the Normans. So he didn't have anything to do with the Normans per se, Saint Claros, Ayos Claros. However, when he reposed, the pagan Normans invaded the same area. And then later when they became Christian, they kind of they used his name, of course, but unfortunately the Normans became very heretical. And the Normans will be the source militarily for the papalization of much of the West after 1054. But now, when it comes to the Rus, now we'll discuss more the Rus. Now, through the late 800s and into the 900s, the more easterly Viking groups were traveling along the large rivers through Eastern Europe, like the Dnieper River, that flows down into from the far north, down into the Black Sea, and into an area influenced by, of course, that part of the sphere of influence of the Eastern Roman Empire. And there was indeed a lot of trade between the Vikings and the Eastern Roman Empire through the Rus. Now, the Rus themselves were originally a mix of people. The original Rus themselves were actually the Vikings who traveled down and established settlements like Kiev. But because they were living in a population that was, of course, East Slavic, the Eastern Slavic tribes, they were also very heavily Slavic and Slavicized. So there was a Rus element, but they were also Slavicized. Now, of course, they would have been pagan at this point. There were some local individual conversions and baptisms to Orthodoxy by some people, especially, of course, most prominently Saint Olga of Kiev, who was the grandmother of Prince Saint Vladimir of Russia, who will convert the entire kingdom of the Rus to Orthodoxy. And remember, it's important to remember that names like Olga Oleg, um, those are actually of Germanic origin, a Norse origin. And we can see like a name like Olga, it actually is from the name, the Germanic word name Helga. And that name Helga is a form of the word in English. Remember, English is a Germanic language, the word holy. Because the word, now in modern English, the word holy, 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 was the final G that was once in English, like in Old English, was dropped. Because it used to be Heilig. Heilig was the form of the word holy in Old English, but then the G was dropped. But in other Germanic dialects and like in Old Norse, the G was preserved, and that became a name like Helga, and the masculine form being Oleg, and then of course this became Slavicized as Olga and Oleg, and even the name Vladimir comes from Valdemir, which was of Norse origin. And of course, the Rus become a very important partner in trade, of course, with the Eastern Roman Empire and with many of the groups in this area. Now, when it comes to the trade routes, there were two major trade routes between the Rus and the people to the south. The one trade route that was very important was on the Dnieper River that led into the Black Sea, of course, leading straight to Constantinople itself. There was another route along the Volga River that led to the Caspian Sea, which is here, which led more to the Islamic states here, and to the Islamic world here in this area, and that's very important because of what will be happening as as with the Rus and their encounter with a lot of these people, because now, unlike the Viking groups or the Norse in the other areas, the Rus, who we consider to be not fully Norse, remember, they are technically Slavs, but with a little bit of a Norse influence within them also. So but the Rus are encountering a lot of different groups of people. They were encountering, for example, the 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 Khazars here, the Bulgars here, and some of the other groups here. And I'm going to get to each of them in a moment. But as we move forward, because I'm going to move forward now towards the year of the baptism of the Rus, in the year 988 here. And as we see here, there's another group that kind of just bounced in, the Pecheneg. Now what happens is, it's probably not a coincidence that this happened at this point, because remember, as the Rus are becoming closer and closer with the Eastern Roman Empire, we have this sort of this group that kind of forces their way right in between. And now remember, when it comes to the geography and the vegetation, it's hard to see on this map. I put it back on the topographical version, but here we can see here that as I said in the previous videos, this area above Crimea and above the Caspian Sea area is called the Pontic Caspian Sea. It's a flat area. It's the steppe with it's very little vegetation. It's like open, flat grassland, which stretches across Central Asia all the way towards China. But as you get to the north of it, and it's hard to tell, but roughly where actually the territory of the Kievan Rus is. So this orangey red area here of the Rus states here, this is roughly where the actual tree line is. Because once you go into this area and towards Kiev, it's actually very foresty in this area. So the transition from forest and woodland into the steppe is roughly the area of the border of the Rus. And remember, the steppe area had been the entrance of all the different people invading Europe from earlier times. Like, as we mentioned earlier in videos on this playlist, the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars coming down, and then the Magyars, which became the Hungarians. And now there's another group of people called the Kuman and the Pecheneg, which are shown here. And of course, the Pecheneg are a Turkic group ruling over this area. An area that is somewhat modern day Romania. And remember, The people that are the ancestors of the modern Romanian people, and I didn't really mention them in the videos, but they're very important because remember, within part of this area, we have the people like the Wallachians, the Moldavians, and the Transylvanians, who are basically the Romanian people today. And they were still speaking a Eastern dialects of the Latin from going way back to when this area was part of the Roman Empire, and this area was Latin speaking and Orthodox, of course, but becomes always was Orthodox and part of the Constantinople's influence. But we have this Pecheneg also now ruling over this area, and an area that was heavily Christian, because remember, the ancestors of the Romanians were living in this area and were Orthodox Christian. So basically, most of the shores of the Black Sea were Orthodox. And remember, Crimea itself was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. But now, these Pecheneg were very violent, and they used to harass a lot of the people coming, either people who were coming to the north into the Rus territory or coming south. So even when, after 988, when the Rus become Orthodox, you will see that there's a lot of danger in traveling in between, in this area of the steppe, in between the Rus territory and the territory of Constantinople. Now, getting back to the Rus themselves, we know that Saint Olga, who was the grandmother of Saint Vladimir, Prince Vladimir, she had become Orthodox Christian in the 950s. But for the most part, most of the Rus population were still pagan, and even her grandson, Prince Vladimir, was still pagan. And he had built a lot of the pagan, temples for the Slavic idols in Kiev, but in other places. Now, of course, through a lot of contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, he genuinely becomes Orthodox Christian. And it's something that is a very important thing also to distinguish, because in a lot of the secular history, especially when it comes to the North, it's always kind of just explained away like, oh, well, they just became Christian for some political expediency, when that is certainly not the case. Even with the other Viking groups that become Christian, it was because they did genuinely convert to Christ. So we cannot say that they're just just for political reasons. Now, Prince Vladimir does engage in a very famous voyage to explore the different faiths. And when he sees, of course, Hagia Sophia and Constantinople and the divine services, it does touch his heart, and he does see the truth of the faith. And I'm going to get to that right now. And of course, Prince Vladimir was the son of Sviatoslav, and he had seized power around the year 980. There is a history called the Primary Chronicle that is also that is mentioned also even in the church history itself about Saint Vladimir, and how he went actually to the Muslims and to the Jews, and interestingly to the Latins at this time. Uh, but with each one, he was kind of disappointed with each group. So he goes to the Muslims. Now remember, the Muslims in this case is actually this group of people here in pink, the Bulgars. I kind of briefly just mentioned them in one of the earlier videos, because remember, the Bulgars themselves were a Turkic tribes that had migrated from much farther east, from a larger Turkic state called the Gokturks, and they had migrated further west, and they had settled roughly within the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And then, and this is in the 600s, and then in the middle of the 600s, they had fractured, and the largest group of them had settled in the area of Thrace, and here above Constantinople, and basically merged with the Slavs, and that was the ethnogenesis of the Bulgarians, where the Bulgarians were primarily Slavic, but with a Bulgar element that was also there. Um, so we see now, but there was other groups of Bulgars. There was like a small group of Bulgars that even entered into Italy. But there was another, the second largest group of the Bulgars went in a completely different direction, and they went up the Volga River. So these Bulgars were known as the Volga Bulgars. They were, I guess you can say, very distant cousins to the Bulgars that assimilated into the Bulgarians. But these Volga Bulgars were actually Muslim. They were actually converts to Islam. So there was an Islamic state very far north, actually, right to the east of the Rus. And I kind of, well, because they're no longer on the map for some reason, but when the Pechenegs passed through this area, they sort of destabilized this group, the Khazars. And I mentioned them in the previous videos and their controversy, because a lot of times, of course, the Khazars, they're associated with the Jews because it is true that around the time of the middle of the 800s, at least the elite ruling class of the Khazars and their Khan, the Khanate, their Khans and their nobility had converted to rabbinical Judaism. And that is confirmed in multiple sources. It's confirmed in Islamic sources, in Jewish sources, between like prominent rabbis of that time conversing with the Khazars. And also in, of course, in Orthodox Christian sources, which is the most important, because we know that Saint Kyrillos and Saint Methodios actually went to the Khazars to evangelize the Khazars. And remember, the Khazars, that was when on their journey they found the relics of Saint Clement of Rome was revealed in Crimea, because remember Saint Clement of Rome who was actually ironically the Bishop of Rome in the early in the first century, one of the early bishops of Rome, just after the time of the apostles. Of course, he was martyred. He was exiled and then martyred in Crimea, and his relics were revealed to Saint Kyrillos and Saint Methodios during their evangelization of the Khazars. But remember, the Khazars did not completely just become Jews or convert to rabbinical Judaism. It was only the elite within them. And what happens is the Khazars were actually a very mixed population. A lot of the Khazars actually were Orthodox Christian, because remember, you have the Georgian states like Abkhazia here, which is Orthodox Christian. Also, the Alans, who were another group, they're not on the map, but they're here. They lived. The Alans were an old Iranic-speaking people that live in the Caucasus, even to this day, in the region of Alania, Ossetia, and Alania. But they were Orthodox Christian, and they lived under the rule of the Khazars. So there were some within the Georgians, the Abkhazians, the Kartli people that were Orthodox that living under Khazar rule, and some of the actual Khazars themselves were Orthodox, because this coastland here would have been heavily Christian because it was still very much in the sphere of the Eastern Roman Empire, and of course we have Crimea here, and there were some Khazars who were Muslim also. So it was, and we know that there is documentation from within the Khazar how the way they ruled was that their leader might have been a Jew or at least identified as part of rabbinical Judaism, but they actually established courts where they had a representation of like Christian and Muslim. So it was they were somewhat diverse, the Khazars. Uh, Now, the Khazars eventually completely collapsed, partially because the Pecheneg will pass through them and destabilize them, and then later the Rus, the Orthodox Russians, will also conquer them and destabilize them. And their descendants really disappear, and a lot of them do become Christian and are assimilated into the Rus. Some of them might have continued on as, let's say, as Jews within Crimea, and might have become maybe groups within Crimea. But remember, they're not necessarily associated with like later, more modern Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. Because remember, most of the Eastern European Jews in later times, their ancestors were actually in Western Europe, the ones that spoke Yiddish. And they were at times the Papists had expelled them and were pushed into Eastern Europe. Um, and I'll get a little bit into that in later videos with the dynamic when it comes to the Jews in some of these areas. But they were pushed, so they were not necessarily connected necessarily with the Khazars. But remember, it's important to understand that this area in-between area, like in between the Rus and the Eastern Roman Empire, was very there was it was kind of a patchwork of people. There were some Christians, there was some, I guess you can say, the Jews because of the Khazars. There were Muslims in some places, and remember, a place like Crimea was incredibly had a very big mix of people, because there will be a mix of people within Crimea also. But a lot of these people do get absorbed into the Greek-speaking population of this area. Like Crimea, for example, um, will will actually and will even Crimea actually still to and even in this time had a Goth population. If we recall from earlier videos, the Goths had controlled um, much of Eastern Europe before before the Slavs, and then most of them had moved to the west, but a very small group had actually survived, and the Goths were Orthodox. They had abandoned whatever Arianism they had, and they had become Orthodox. And there's a very, very famous saint from Crimea, a Goth saint, a Crimean Goth, called Saint John of Crimea. This was, of course, later times. We'll get into this in later times, but when we get up to it. But a lot of their descendants assimilated into the Greek-speaking and Greek-speaking Orthodox population. So a lot of people actually assimilated into the Greek-speaking Orthodox population and in later times, especially as the area became more Orthodox. Uh, so getting back to Saint Vladimir, and now that we understand kind of the cultural context of what was going on, he went to the Muslims, and but he was disappointed with basically with Islam, and then he went to the Jews, and interestingly, he found that the Jews were constantly whining about their lost homeland, um, and primarily it was probably the Khazars. Um, and then he went, interestingly, with the Latins, and it's interesting because the Latins technically, remember by Latins I don't mean all of the Orthodox West. Like I said, like there were some, because there were some that were more Orthodox in some places, but primarily the primary group of the uh, of the Latins at this point that were coming into the East usually were coming from East Francia. So from basically this the what became, oh, let me move back forward again. Really, this area. So basically, like the East Francia area, which unfortunately now is called this, but um, they were the ones that were primarily going into the East. But you can see that Saint Vladimir, even though technically they were in communion with Constantinople and with the rest of the Orthodox Church, you could still see that there is the difference already. Like it was like even Saint Vladimir was able to discern that there was something kind of spiritually dead with these Latins, and because he even says that they were very bland and very like just spiritually dead. Uh, uh, so then, but of course, when he goes into Hagia Sophia and sees the divine service, and of course his famous words are with his envoy. Remember, the Rus. He says, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such beauty." And so it's not just about the external aspect, of course, of the beauty of the liturgy, but also even just noetically, it touched his soul because he saw that true orthodoxy when he was in Constantinople, and not the more corrupting influences, obviously, of the Latins at this time. And of course, Saint Vladimir is baptized in the year 988. Oops, let me go forward again. 988, and and then at the same time, a large number of the Rus. And when we celebrate this, we this is commemorated, of course, the baptism of the Rus, which happened in the year 988. So in the year 1988, it would have been the 1,000-year anniversary of the baptism of the Rus. Now, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time was Emperor Basil II, or Vasilios II. And his his sister Anna was married to Saint Vladimir. So she became Saint Anna of also Rus, but she was Greek of Constantinople, and her name is sometimes titled as Anna Porphyrogenitos because the name Porphyrogenitos, meaning born in the purple, meant one of the royal titles of a lot of the emperors in the in the Eastern Roman Empire. And of course, this dynasty was the Macedonian dynasty, the very famous Macedonian dynasty in the Eastern Roman Empire during this particular period. And interestingly, as we can see, in the year 988, we have this brief period where the Eastern Roman Empire was actually able um, to get Antioch back. The very brief period that Antioch in this part of Syria was actually once again part of the Eastern Roman Empire, very briefly. And we know that there were a lot of Antiochian clergy and monks that also helped the evangelization of the Rus, which is why there were some Antiochian influences within the Russians also. Uh, Now, of course, when Saint Vladimir became Christian and was baptized, and the people became baptized, all of the pagan sites and pagan temples of the Rus were destroyed. And of course, the first bishop of Kiev was Metropolitan Saint Michael of Kiev, who was the first metropolitan. Because remember, the church among the Rus, so the Church of Kiev, was a metropolitan bishop as part of the Church of Constantinople. So the Russian church was not autocephalous. It didn't at this time. They were part of the Church of Constantinople. And of course, in terms of language and liturgy in language, um, the primary language liturgically, as now we have this another kingdom, primarily Slavic, becoming Orthodox Christian. They would have continued on using the Church Slavonic, which was being used in the other Slavic Orthodox kingdoms like Bulgaria. And so they would have just continued that tradition within the Rus now. Now remember, like every other group of people, ethnically, not everybody is always a monolith. So like I said, the Kievan Rus primarily were the East Slavic tribes, but also had a Germanic Norse element in the ancestry of some of the ruling class, like, of course, of Saint Vladimir, Saint Olga, and some of the nobility. And also there were even other groups of people within the territory under the Rus. Like, for example, there were some of these places, um, small tribes of the Uralic people that also lived in this area. Like the Uralic people are another group of people that to this day live in the far north, mostly within Siberia. And but the Finns are a Uralic people. The people in the far north, even to this day, that live along the northern parts of Scandinavia, the Sami people, the Samoyedic people, are Uralic people. Um, and the Estonians are Uralic people even to this day. So some of the Uralic people were assimilated into the Russians, into the Rus. So this is all part of the ethnogenesis. And then, of course, we'll have these as the Rus expand into these areas. Some of these people, like the Volga Bulgars, and some of the other, there were small Turkic tribes interspersed in this area. They will also be, well, like some of the Khazars, for example, but even the other ones, like the Bulgars, and some of the other ones that are just not named here, um, they will also be incorporated into the Russians and assimilated into the Russians. Uh, there's another group, like there are even some Uralic groups, like even to this day, like the Udmurts that live in this area, and then there's the Uralic people like the Khanty and the Mansi, who are very closely related to the Magyars, the Hungarians. They will all be incorporated into the Rus as the Rus kind of later on move into this area. But even from this early point, many of those people were assimilated into the Rus. Now here we have a map of some of the Rus principalities, because remember, under the time of Saint Vladimir, the principalities were somewhat unified, but not long after him, they were somewhat somewhat fractured. And so we have here, these are the Rus principalities. Of course, around Kiev, the primary was the Principality of Kiev. And then next we have uh, Pereyaslavo, Chernigov, Rostov, Suzdal, Novgorod in the north. And Novgorod is also a very important city among the Rus. It's a much more northern city, going almost all the way towards Finland, in eastern Scandinavia, but it's one of the more northerly cities among the Rus also, and the southerly being Kiev, of course, and then Halich or Galicia, Polotsk, and like I said, Novgorod, Chernigov, Smolensk. These are all cities and principalities within the Rus, and of course these areas locally will all become Orthodox Christian. For the most part, the primary bishop will be the Metropolitan of Kiev. There will at times be another bishop, sometimes within the next few hundred years, in places like Galicia and Novgorod, but primarily the bishop will be the Bishop of Kiev as a Metropolitan bishop. And many of these bishops are very holy bishops, of course, during this time, because we're still in the year 988, but now going into the beginning of the 1000s, 1000s, the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s. This is there's many holy bishops that are saints that we commemorate in Orthodoxy even to this day. Now, the conversion of the Rus to Orthodoxy is so important because as the West is falling away, we have this miracle of the conversion of the Rus, and the Russians themselves will be a very important defenders of Orthodoxy in later times, when a lot of the rest of the Orthodox Christians fall under Islamic rule even after the fall of Constantinople. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there won't be some corrupting influences that happen within the Russians, even from a very early time. But but for the most part, it will still be an Orthodox Christian kingdom, an empire, as it becomes an empire in later times. Now, some of that influence, the corruption, we'll get to that corruption as we get to it much later. But for now, in this early time, this early history of the Orthodox Christian Russians, um, the next main tribulation that happens to the Russians is when they are, for the most part, actually conquered by the Mongols in the Mongol invasion that will come later in the 12 and 1300s. But we're not up to that yet. That will be in the next few videos. But for now, this area is, of course, becoming more and more Orthodox. And it's somewhat of a battleground because some of these groups, like the Polish, will be coming to Christianity, but through the corrupting Franks, and they will be allied with the Pap and will be Papist and part of the Papist world in later times, and that will also cause a lot of the troubles that happen in this area in later times. Now, subsequent to the time of Saint Vladimir, now as we enter now the next millennium, the year after the year 1000, on a state level of the groups of the Norse, that's when primarily they come to, well, they become Christian, uh, and not through the East though, but through the Latin West that was falling pretty much. So we have here Denmark in the time of Harald Bluetooth. Remember, Bluetooth is also where we get even the technology Bluetooth. That's why the symbol of the Bluetooth technology, the wireless technology, kind of looks like a runic symbol because it's named after Harald Bluetooth. And then, of course, we have um, Iceland itself. Iceland becomes Christian in the year of, whoops, where is it? Here, around the year 1000. And then in Greenland and parts of Canada, Vinland, and Newfoundland, Leif Erikson, who was the primary leader in this area, Leif Erikson became a Christian in the year around the year also 1000. Um, of course, we know that with the Danelaw, it was more gradual because the Danelaw didn't necessarily have a single leader. There was a leader that did become Christian, but for the most part, they just assimilated into the population of the Orthodox English at this time. And of course, as I said, the Normans around the year 911. The Swedes were probably among the last of the Norse to become Christian. For them, it wasn't until the end of the first century of the 1000s. Oh, and of course, in this part of Scandinavia, which was the area of Norway, on the western part, we have, of course, a very important saint, Saint Olaf. Saint Olaf, enlightener of Norway, and Saint Olaf was also a king. Um, but because there was Olaf Tryggvason, and then there was also Saint Olaf, who and where the Norway becomes Christian on the state level in around the year 1000, between 995 and the year 1030. Now the next video, now that let me just move forward a little bit. Now that we are in the year, or in the next, now the new millennium, of the the discussion will be leading up to the Great Schism, which also technically is a great apostasy in this case, because this is not, remember, the Great Schism is not a division in the church. It's not two Orthodox churches that just have a break in communion, or like two Orthodox churches where one, maybe there's heresy going on and there's breaking communion, but they're still Orthodox. No, this is a schism that is a schism of apostasy, where, remember, the papal the Patriarchate of Rome was already falling into the heresy before this, like I've explained. But now, with the 1054 and this schism in 1054, it is actually apostasy, where now it just fully falls into heresy of the Patriarchate of Rome. Even though in some places there's still orthodoxy hanging on very, very briefly. And I'm going to get to that in the next video. But basically now the takeover of papism is a very violent conquest now, especially through the Normans. We will see after 1054 the violent conquest of papism to every corner of the West, including even in Hispania, where gradually over the next centuries we have the Spanish Reconquista of pushing the Muslims out, but also enforcing papism, and very militant papism, by the way. And so papism will be forcefully pushed, and then of course we will have the Crusades, which is just a continuation of the forceful conquest of the Papists, to basically conquer the Orthodox and to bring Orthodoxy into the anti-ecclesia or anti-church, or a counterfeit church, which is what we see happening even all the way up until modern times through things like ecumenism. So this video will end here, and we will get more up to now the first century of the new millennium and what was going on. But that's all for now. Glory to God. Doxa toteo.